Hello, it's Leslie Taylor Brett here from Balance Saddle Company and the Balance Organisation. Just making this little video as a reminder to those of you who already own Balance saddles and are using the Balance saddling system as a form of functional saddling. To just a reminder and an encouragement really to check the pad system and the way the saddle's working on a regular basis, because that's such a great feature of this way of working with the saddles. And I think some people forget and they just use the same pad arrangement, the same saddle, and assume that everything's as good as it can be. But the great thing about using this approach is that it is designed to allow the owner of the horse and the rider of the horse to constantly sort of monitor and fine-tune the way the saddle is feeling and working for the horse. So the question is, are you taking advantage of this feature and getting the best results from your saddle and the best comfort for your horse? The next few slides and what I'm talking about hopefully will encourage you to do that if you're not doing it already, and you might discover all sorts of interesting things and find that you can make things even better than they currently are. So hope it's useful for you. The great thing about the balance saddling system is that it provides the horse owner and the rider with this wonderful way of being able to monitor the continued suitability and the fine-tuning of the comfort of the saddle in ways that other saddle fitting systems don't tend to do. As long as you've got the saddle that is wide enough to accommodate the pad system and you've got the right selection of pads, you've got this fantastic toolkit really to work with your horse. And it's lovely to know that you can get access to the knowledge and the experience of a saddle fitter to actually come and see you and look at the saddle themselves. But it's even better when in between those times you have this way of being able to take care of yourself and take care of your own horse, and that's what this system does. And whether you realize it or not, every time you put a saddle on the horse when you go to ride, you're actually playing in the role of a saddle fitter, because it's your responsibility to be looking at the saddle on a day-to-day basis and just making sure, not assuming that it's all fine and dandy, but to be looking, because the horse's body shape and his back shape can change quite dramatically within his lifetime, and even within a few days or a week, depending on what's going on in his life, he can change quite a lot, insofar as his posture can change, the actual width of the measurable width of the horse's back can change, just from things like changing the way you're riding. So if you go to a new trainer and you start riding a different way, it's going to have an influence on the functioning of the whole animal, and therefore it's reflected in its body shape. Changing the way the feet are managed can make some differences. The sort of food that the horse is on, just about everything you can imagine that's going on in a horse's life will have some impact, either positive or negative, on his state of health and functionality. And this in turn has an impact on his body shape, and therefore the way the saddle sits on him and works with him. So that's why it's so important, and it's necessary to have a way of looking at this and actually making adjustments as you go along, not waiting for somebody to come for an appointment every 6 months or every year from a saddle fitter. Much as that's also nice, I'm not saying that that's the wrong thing, but you need something else as well. And that's what I want to talk to you about in this little presentation, how that happens and why it's important. In order to really assess the way a saddle is fitting, if you like, and we don't tend to use that word so often with balance system because we don't want the saddle to fit in a conventional understanding of the word, but how the saddle is actually sitting on the horse and therefore how it's balanced and how much stability it has. You're going to want to put the saddle on without any pads underneath to start with. And first and foremost, make sure that the saddle is positioned correctly, because it's surprising how often we see people months or even years after they bought their balance saddle and find that over time they've gradually started to put the saddle on a little bit too far forward, because that's what we tend to see with so many other people who are riding in saddles, is their saddles are put on habitually too far forward and it starts to look normal again. So make sure that the saddle is positioned and pushed back so that it actually is allowing freedom of the shoulder blade. And the photograph on the bottom right hand corner here, down here, you can see that this saddle is actually a little bit too far forward. It has an impact on the balance of the saddle, because when you put the saddle too far forward, it tends to, the shape of the body of the horse tends to push the saddle up at the front, and so it creates a sort of false impression of the balance of the saddle, and it can look very level, look stable, when it's actually not in the right position. So when you move the saddle back so that it's well behind the shoulder blade to allow for that rotation, then you get a different picture, because then the front of it will tend to drop more. And that's what you need to be careful of when you're actually positioning the saddle. So make sure you feel for the positioning of the horse's shoulder blade in its standing posture, and make sure the saddle is sitting well behind that. And I'm talking about the part of the saddle really that corresponds to where the front of the tree sits. The more forward cut the saddle is in its flap shape, so a jumping saddle for example, the more difficult it is. But then of course the flap in itself is flexible. It's the solid part of the saddle and the tree that in particular you need to make sure is positioned further back. The picture of this black and white picture here is showing a saddle that is sitting rather conventionally. In other words, it's sitting level without any of the pads on. And the levelness, when you're looking at levelness, remember you're looking more at the deepest part of the seat here, and more than anything else, not trying to match the height of the pommel and the cantle. That's not reliable, because different saddles have different pommels and cantle heights. So it's the balance of the seat in particular. On this slide you can see the three images. The one on the left is showing the shape that is quite common to see with balanced saddle, and in this method of the saddle taken from the front, so that you can sort of see the amount of clearance over the horse's withers. From a conventional saddle fitting point of view, this would probably look rather low and would be considered for the saddle to be too wide, and try and use a narrower saddle to get more height. When you're using a functional method of saddling, this is what you're looking for. The saddle looks a little lower, but it does have clearance. So if you slid your fingers along between the top of the horse's spine and the wither area and the lowest part of the tree, which is slightly further back, you still have space to slide your flat fingers down, and that's important. The saddle must never be resting on the horse's withers before you start padding it. The padding is not there to hold the saddle up off the horse's withers. That's not good. So check on that, and as long as you've got clearance, as far as a horse is concerned, clearance is clearance. It's either clear and not putting pressure on, or it's not clear and putting pressure on. So check for that. The middle picture, it shows again another saddle, one of our saddles that is sitting lower at the front than at the back, and you can see the back is lifting, which again shows you that you've got space to use our pad system underneath, and the one on the right is showing where, in this case, the saddle looked fairly level until the pommel was pushed down. Then you can see the lift at the back, which again is indicating that we've got space to use our pad system. And remember, our pad system, when it's used correctly, always has more depth of padding under the front of the saddle. That's why this is important. So the next thing to think about is, what sort of riding are you planning on doing? Because that's going to have an effect on what padding system, how you pad the saddle, and the sort of balance of the saddle that you're going to achieve. So for general riding, hacking out, where you'll sort of walk, trot, canter, maybe pop over a little jump occasionally, then you're trying to achieve an arrangement with the pads that has the saddle sitting level. No more pads than you actually need. There's no value in having more pads, more layers, because the more layers you have, the more potential you have for instability, unless the rider's very stable in their own riding. And there's no benefit to the horse to have more padding than is absolutely necessary. But you have to have enough to keep that comfort level and always have a little bit more under the front than under the rest of the saddle. But you're looking to achieve a state where the saddle is balanced, the seat is balanced, and stable. That's about it. It's very simple. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, we've got in remedial saddling, where you're taking a horse that's probably got a lot of muscle wastage, either from a previous tight saddle or after a layoff because it's been lame or injured. You're going to have a situation probably where the natural healthy shape and width of the horse is quite a long way from where it is now. So you're going to be working with a saddle that is quite a lot wider than its current damaged shape. And therefore you're going to be using layers of pads to replace the missing muscle. So as I said, the more layers of padding you have and that you need, the more the potential is for the saddle to feel unstable to the rider and to the horse. So you have to be keeping that in mind. And once the saddle starts to feel particularly unstable, the horse doesn't benefit very much anyway. So, but hopefully, in a remedial process like this, the actual demands that are being made on the horse and the type of riding that is being done is carefully monitored, and it is a remedial form of training and riding. So it's a controlled thing, and so that the fact that you've got more padding underneath shouldn't be an issue. You're not going to be competing the horse when it's going through a remedial process, I hope. Now let's look at a couple of other situations where you would want to have a different approach to the padding to achieve a slightly different effect. If we look at dressage, now if the more skilled and trained the horse and rider are to achieve a really good state of engagement and collection, the more important this is. If you're only doing sort of very basic schooling and training, then most of the time your general padding arrangement is fine. But once you start getting to a place where you are helping the horse to engage more, what happens is, in that engagement, in that state, the whole of the front of the horse starts to lift as the hindquarters engage and the hind feet step furthermore underneath the horse to carry the weight. And so as the front, if you can imagine, the front of the horse is lifting and filling with the correct use of its body, that's going to have an impact on the saddle balance. So it will also lift the front of the saddle. And so if you start off with that saddle absolutely level before the session starts and at the beginning of the ride, can you see how, as the horse engages and the session progresses, there's a risk that the saddle will start to sit up too high in the front, lower at the back, encourage the rider to sit too far back in the saddle, and that in turn makes it much more likely that once the rider is sitting behind the movement of the horse, for the rider to start driving the saddle forward up the horse's neck, and that's not helpful either. So with the more advanced dressage riders, I think pay attention to that, and you may well want to pad your saddle in such a way and use a width of saddle that sees it sitting very slightly lower at the front, and I'm talking small degrees, than you expect to see it at the end. And obviously you still need to have more padding under the front than at the back to achieve the functional saddling effect, but keep that in mind. Don't try to get the saddle absolutely level before you start, when you know that during your session the horse is going to engage more and come up at the front and lower at the back. And in contrast to that, when we look at horses that are used for jumping, particularly jumping higher levels and going cross country, this is where the rider's weight tends to be focused much more in the front of the saddle for more of the time. And so in this situation, we do the opposite way around. We would have the saddle sitting, if anything, slightly higher, having more padding under the front. So that here we can see some pictures of different padding arrangements, and one of the things I'd say straight off is just to remind everyone that we do different types of saddle pads. This one is what we call the regular quilt, which is not terribly thick. It's got the wool fleece lining and stuff, but it's, in terms of its actual thickness and the amount of cushioning it provides on its own, it's not huge. So this is the sort of pad we would think that most the horses that have really recovered fully, have got very little muscle wastage, are very confident and strong in their bodies, they can go into this pad quite happily, and just with the minimum padding, which is the picture, if you see the picture on the top left, which is the regular weight quilt and a 1/4 inch JB pad. So that's the minimum that's the minimum amount of padding that you can use when if you're still trying to use a functional saddling method. If you haven't got room for a 1/4 inch JB pad, then the saddle's not wide enough to use in this way, then you're working with a more conventional fit, and you won't get quite so many benefits. The picture to the right on the top, I'll just point to that here. So this one is the large 1/4 inch JB pad, and sometimes if the horse needs a little bit more lift a bit further back, this is a good option to use. Down in the bottom left corner here, what I'm showing you is where I've put the JB pad set slightly further back, and this is definitely something that a lot of you could be experimenting with if you haven't done it already, because if you've got the option to be able to move the JB pad slightly further back so it's tucked underneath the front of the saddle, it can make the front edge of the saddle feel very soft for the horse's shoulder to rotate under. So having the JB pad right up at the front, it's not wrong, but it's going to feel firmer to the horse as the shoulders rotate back towards and under the front of the saddle. If you've got room, if you're able to, and you experiment by moving the JB pad back a couple of inches so that so when you look at it, you can't see the front of the JB pad at the front of the saddle. You'll see that the front of the saddle is sort of floating slightly, and I see a lot of horses that just moving that pad back slightly can make a massive difference too. Down here you can see another combination where we've got the the regular weight saddle pad, and then there's one of our wool base pads on top, and then a JB pad, a 1/4 inch JB pad on top of that, and again layered in. And this is just a reminder that, and this is written in the manual, and it's probably been said by your consultant if you've had a consultant involved, is that we definitely do not recommend that you use any of the 1/2 inch JB pad on top of the regular quilt pad, because there's not enough thickness in that pad to sort of blend away the difference in the height between the 1/2 inch JB. Some horses won't really notice it, but there are other horses who are sensitive and they will notice. It's not a question of having pressure, it's actually where you can get a slight loss of contact, like a tiny bit of bridging in behind the end of the JB pad, just in a place where some horses find that difficult. So for that reason, we suggest that you don't use the 1/2 inch JB pad directly on top of the regular quilt. And in fact, most horses, certainly in my experience, if the horse is given the chance to choose and to express an opinion between having the regular quilt pad and what we call cushion quilt, which is you'll see in the pictures below, they will go for the cushion quilt. It's just has a nicer feel for most horses, I think. It doesn't look as pretty from the rider's perspective, I think. In a saddle shaped pad like this, you don't really see much of it. It's more of an issue if you're using a square. But the cushion quilt is, to say, the first choice for, I would say, the majority of horses if they're allowed to choose. And on this pad, because it's thicker, then you can use the 1/2 inch JB pad set directly on top of it if you don't need a base pad. There's another arrangement to the right hand corner of the picture here. Here you'll see the cushion quilt saddle pad, and then a layered effect of using the 1/4 inch large JB and then a 1/4 inch regular JB on top, again to create that sort of more lift, which again, this is a such situation where you might use, for example, one of the JBs for flat work and then add the second JB for jumping. That's a good example. And I'm hoping as we're talking about this that you're seeing how that this whole system of using the pads is very flexible, and it needs you to really be willing to experiment, and as I said before, not just assume that the pad system that you set off with when you get a saddle and start off with it is what you should be using for the rest of the horse's life or the rest of the time in that saddle. There's so many little things that you can do to fine-tune and use the horse as your most reliable reference by trying things. So on this slide, what I'm showing you here is a way of working with a Remedial B pad. Now, the Remedial B pad can have its uses when you can see that the horse is rather dropped in its back, and you're trying to get the saddle to be level and stable. We do 2 thicknesses, 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch. But you need to remember that in order to work with this system, remember you always have more depth of padding under the front of the saddle than at the back. So here on the picture that you see on the top left hand corner here, you have got the cushion quilt, and then you've got a 1/2 inch JB at the front, set back again to try and sort of make sure there's space for the shoulders, and then a 1/4 inch Remedial B at the back. So with this arrangement, you've still got more depth of padding under the front. On the picture on the right here. Now this is quite an interesting one, because for some of you that have got horses that are very short in the back, and you're trying to keep the saddle pressure away from that back edge, particularly if the horse is a bit weak in there, you can also create this scenario where exactly the same pads, 1/2 inch JB at the front, remedial B at the back, by moving those towards each other so that they are, I haven't got a photograph of it, that's why there's a diagram, by moving them together so that they sit in the middle, but they don't extend all the way to the front and the back of the saddle. You can see how the very back of the panels and the front of the saddle sort of floats and takes the pressure away from those areas. And it's rather like if you could imagine having an adult saddle and using a pony-sized base pad. You're achieving the same sort of effect, but with these two smaller pads. That's another thing that you can experiment with if you happen to have a horse that is. Here's again a reminder of using the base pad in a slightly alternative way as well if you need to, because in the same way as you can move the JB pad slightly back at the front of the saddle, you can, if you want to, experiment with moving the base pad slightly forward again, so you're achieving this effect, and I'm trying to show it in these diagrams below. So if the base pad, for example, the purple line is trying to show the base pad, if that extends all the way to the back, then obviously you're going to get the saddle sitting on the whole of that pad. That's not a problem for most horses, but you can move the base pad slightly forward, and then again you've got the back of the panel just floating, and obviously when the rider's sitting on that, the saddle will come down and you will get some contact here, because the base pad, particularly if it's a 1/4 inch base pad, you're going to get some, but it will be slightly less. And again, for some horses, this is sort of quite relevant where you've got a taller rider on a shorter backed horse, where you're trying to you need the rider to have the saddle that is big enough to accommodate their length of leg and size, but you've got a horse that's slightly short at the back. This is another thing that is useful to play around with. Before we leave this subject, I just wanted to make a comment, because I know some people, when I talk to them about this idea of having either the back of the saddle or the front of the saddle floating off the edge of the Pro Complete pads, either the JB or the base pad, they get very bothered about the idea of having an edge, and in most people's minds an edge equals pressure, but of course in this situation it doesn't. If you look at the way the pads are made and the materials they're made of, what happens is you don't get a ridge. It may be an edge, but it's not a pressure point. So that's not something to worry about, but it is something I know people get concerned about, so I just thought it was worth mentioning. So as we come to the end of this presentation, just wanted to go back a step and remind everybody to think about the actual state of the saddle pad. We're talking a lot about the adjustable pad system to fine-tune balance, but let's go back to the actual saddle pad and make sure that that is still pulled up off the wither before you put the saddle on top, and then after the saddle is on, making sure all the pads are pulled well up into the gullet of the saddle. That's an important thing. And also just something as silly as noticing how clean the pad is, because once the fleece is either too dirty or too hairy, it cannot do the job it's designed to do, and so you lose a lot of the benefits of that. And I have created an actual video on the care and the cleaning of the wool fleece pads that you might want to look up. I think that's on our YouTube channel. And just to finish off by saying, I'm encouraging all of you to not just assume everything is as good as it can be, but to get curious, be willing to work with the horse, and remember that the horse is the most reliable form of feedback you've got when it comes to deciding what's working and what isn't. So make use of that, give him choices or her choices, and evaluate what changes. And as long as you stick to those basic rules about making sure you've got enough clearance so that you're not going to put direct pressure over the spine, that the saddle is stable, you haven't got too many pads on to make it unstable, then there's a lot of things you can play around with and enjoy actually getting to know how your horse responds and give him choices. So I will leave you with that thought. If you get stuck, you don't have easy access to a balance trained functional saddling consultant, don't forget that more of them are now offering distant consultations and distant support, so don't feel that you're stuck without any help. And that's about it, so I'll leave you with that thought. Happy riding.